There is a kind of change that does not announce itself. It does not come with a declaration or a speech. It does not arrive on the front page of a newspaper or in the words of a president standing at a podium. It moves quietly, the way water moves through stone, not breaking it, not shattering it, but shaping it slowly over years and decades, until one day you look at the stone and realize it is something entirely different from what it once was. That is the kind of change this story is about. This is the story of America's silent evolution, not the loud history, not the wars and the elections and the dramatic turning points that fill textbooks and documentaries. This is the other history, the one that happened in between those moments, the one that unfolded in living rooms and factory floors and small-town diners and city sidewalks. The history of how ordinary American life transformed, bit by bit, generation by generation, in ways that were barely noticeable at the time, but are now, looking back, absolutely extraordinary. It is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly. So settle in, there is no rush here. To understand how America evolved silently, you have to begin at the beginning. Not the very beginning, not the founding or the revolution, but a beginning that most people can still almost touch, a time that grandparents remember or great-grandparents described. The early 20th century, the years just after the industrial age had changed the physical shape of the country, but had not yet changed the interior shape of its people. In 1900, the United States was a nation of about 76 million people. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Today, the country holds more than 330 million. But the difference is not just in the number of people. It is in where they lived, how they worked, what they expected of life, and what they believed the country owed them, or didn't owe them at all. In 1900, nearly 40% of all Americans still lived and worked on farms. The rhythm of daily life was tied to the seasons. You planted in spring, you harvested in fall. You preserved food in summer so you could survive winter. The land was not a lifestyle choice, it was a necessity, and it shaped everything. The pace of conversation, the structure of families, the relationship between neighbors, the definition of a good life. A good life in that world meant enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough work. The idea that life should be comfortable, that discomfort was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured, that was not yet a widely shared assumption. People endured. That was simply what life required. This is important to understand because so much of what came later, so much of the silent evolution, was a gradual shift away from endurance and toward expectation. Americans, over the course of the 20th century, quietly and collectively began to expect more comfort, more convenience, more choice, more safety, more time, more meaning. This did not happen because of any single law or invention or leader. It happened because of thousands of small decisions made by millions of people, accumulating over decades into something that reshaped the entire character of the nation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay for a little while longer in the world of 1900. The average American home in 1900 had no electricity, no running water, no central heating. Cooking was done on a wood-burning or coal-burning stove. Light came from kerosene lamps. Water was drawn from a well or carried from a pump. The outhouse was still, for most families, not a relic of a primitive past, but simply the way things were. The workday was long. For industrial workers in cities, 12-hour days were common. For farm families, the work never really stopped. It simply changed form depending on the season and the hour. Children worked, not as an exception, not as a moral failure on the part of their parents, but as a normal and expected part of family survival. A 10-year-old who could carry water, feed animals, or tend a garden was a 10-year-old who was contributing to the household's ability to exist. Medical care was available, but it bore almost no resemblance to what we know today. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that invisible microorganisms cause illness, had only been widely accepted for a couple of decades. Antibiotics did not yet exist. Vaccines existed for smallpox, but the broad childhood vaccination programs that would later transform public health were still far in the future. Infections that are today treated with a brief course of medication were, in 1900, frequently fatal. Childbirth was dangerous. Childhood itself was dangerous. It was not unusual for a family to lose 1 or 2 children before those children reached adulthood. Life expectancy at birth in the United States in 1900 was approximately 47 years. That number is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean that most people died at 47. It means that infant and child mortality was so high that when you averaged the ages of death across the entire population, you arrived at that figure. A person who survived childhood and reached the age of 40 could reasonably expect to live into their 60s or 70s, but the chance of surviving childhood itself was far from guaranteed. This was the baseline. This was the world from which the silent evolution began. And what makes it silent, what makes it different from the dramatic history of battles and legislation and crisis, is that most of the people living through it did not experience it as evolution. They experienced it as Tuesday. They experienced it as the slow accumulation of ordinary days, each one slightly different from the last, none of them individually remarkable enough to stop and mark as a turning point. Change, when it happens slowly enough, feels like stillness. And yet, if you could stand outside of time and watch the entire sweep of the 20th century, as though it were a single afternoon, you would see something almost miraculous. You would see a country reinvent itself, not its ideals, not its founding documents, but its physical and social and psychological reality in ways that were deeper and more thorough than almost any political revolution that history has on record. There is a word that historians sometimes use for this kind of change. They call it structural. Structural change means the change is happening in the foundations, in the way things are organized at the most basic level. It's different from political change, which happens at the top. Structural change happens everywhere at once, slowly, invisibly, until the structure itself is something new. What America underwent between roughly 1900 and the end of the 20th century was structural change of almost incomprehensible scale. The country did not just become wealthier, it became organized differently. The family changed its shape, the community changed its meaning, work changed its purpose. Leisure, the very concept of having time that was yours to fill as you chose, transformed from a privilege of the wealthy into something approaching a universal expectation. And underneath all of it, quieter than any of the louder changes, something was happening to the interior life of Americans, to the way they understood themselves, to the stories they told about who they were and what they deserved and what the future might hold. That interior change, that slow, silent shift in the American self, is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. We will trace all of it. We will move through time carefully, pausing to look closely at the details that are easy to miss when history is told at full speed. We will spend time in the decades that are often skipped over, the years that seem on the surface like nothing much was happening, precisely because so much was happening below the surface. This is a history of the in-between, of the years between the great events, of the lives between the famous names, of the changes that no single person caused and no single moment created. It is, in that sense, everyone's history, and it begins as so many profound changes begin, not with a bang, but with something far quieter. It begins with the slow, almost imperceptible loosening of the world that people had always known.
There is something worth understanding about the way people experience the beginning of change. They usually do not recognize it as a beginning. When the first automobiles began appearing on American streets in the early 1900s, most people who saw them did not think, "This will reshape every city in the country. alter the relationship between families and geography, transform the economy, and change the very texture of daily life within a generation. They thought, what a strange and noisy contraption. They thought, that will never replace the horse. They thought, at most, that it was a curiosity, something for the wealthy and the adventurous, not something that would touch their lives in any meaningful way. That is almost always how it works. The things that change everything look, at first, like nothing much at all. The first decade of the 20th century in America was, on the surface, a time of enormous confidence. The country had just come through the industrialization of the late 1800s, with its economy expanded, its cities grown massive and complex, and its sense of itself as a rising world power deeply, almost aggressively established. There was a feeling in the air, not universal, certainly not shared everyone equally, but a feeling nonetheless that America was on the right side of history, and that the future was going to be better than the past. Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House. He was young, vigorous, loud, and full of opinions about everything from foreign policy to the proper diet of an American citizen. He was, in many ways, the perfect symbol for an age that believed in progress, believed in it almost as a religion, with the same certainty and the same willingness to overlook inconvenient contradictions. But the confidence of the early 1900s was built on an uneven foundation. While some Americans were enjoying the fruits of industrialization, steady factory work, growing wages, the early consumer goods that were beginning to appear in catalogs and store windows, others were living in conditions that would be unrecognizable and shocking to almost any American alive today. In the coal regions of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, men and boys descended into the earth before sunrise and came up after dark, spending their days in tunnels barely wide enough to turn around in, breathing air thick with dust that would slowly fill their lungs over years until breathing itself became an act of labor. In the textile mills of the South, children as young as 8 worked 12-hour shifts tending to machines that had no safety guards, in buildings that had no fire escapes. In the meatpacking plants of Chicago, made famous to the wider public in 1906 by a young journalist named Upton Sinclair, workers stood in blood and ice for hours, handling tools that slipped and machinery that did not stop for human error. This was the other face of American progress, and it was, for a very long time, simply accepted, not celebrated, not loved, but accepted as a condition of the world rather than a choice that the world had made. The acceptance of hardship as normal is one of the most important things to understand about early 20th century American life. It was not passivity, exactly. It was not a lack of intelligence or dignity. It was something more like a deeply embedded cultural assumption, the belief that life was hard, that work was supposed to hurt, and that the suffering of ordinary people was simply the price of the larger machinery of civilization continuing to turn. That assumption was about to begin very slowly to crack. The cracking happened through many channels at once. Through journalism, as writers began documenting the conditions of working life in factories and slums in language that middle-class readers could not easily ignore. Through organized labor, as workers began the long, painful, frequently violent process of demanding better conditions and shorter hours. Through politics, as the progressive movement, a loose coalition of reformers, idealists, and pragmatists, began pushing for government intervention in the relationship between employers and employees. And it happened, perhaps most powerfully, through technology. In 1903, 2 brothers from Dayton, Ohio, flew a powered aircraft at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, for the total of 12 seconds. The flight covered 120 feet. The machine weighed 605 pounds and was made of spruce wood, muslin fabric, and a small gasoline engine that the brothers had built themselves because no manufacturer would make one light enough for their purposes. The newspapers mostly ignored it. The New York Times did not cover the story. Most major publications around the country did not either.
A few small papers ran brief items, often skeptical in tone, as though the achievement might turn out to be exaggerated or mistaken. The brothers themselves went back to Dayton, continued their experiments for several more years, largely in obscurity, and it was not until 1908, 5 years later, that their work finally began to receive the attention it deserved. This is a remarkable thing to sit with. One of the most consequential technological achievements in human history happened quietly in a field on the North Carolina coast, and the world mostly looked the other way. But change does not need to be witnessed in the moment to be real. The technology that was changing American life most dramatically in these early years was not the airplane, which remained a curiosity for decades before it became practical. It was something far more mundane. It was electricity. The electrification of American cities and towns was already underway by 1900, but it was still far from complete. In 1907, only about 8% of American homes had electricity. By 1920, that number had risen to about 35%. By 1940, it would reach almost 80%. These numbers are easy to read past, but think about what they actually mean. Electricity did not just replace candles and kerosene lamps with electric light, though it did that. It fundamentally altered the relationship between human beings and time. Before electric light, the end of the day, the setting of the sun, was a hard boundary on most human activity. After dark, you could do limited things by the light of a flame. You could talk, you could sew or do small handwork, you could read if your eyes were good and the flame was steady, but the range of productive activity available to you was sharply constrained by darkness. Electric light erased that boundary. Suddenly, the evening was open. The home was open. Work could continue. Reading became easier. The social life of families, what they did together in the hours after supper, began, almost imperceptibly, to change. And electricity did not stop at light. It moved quickly into other forms. Electric motors began to appear in factories, replacing steam power with something cleaner, quieter, and far more flexible. Electric streetcars reshaped the geography of cities, allowing people to live farther from their workplaces than walking distance had ever permitted. And in the 1910s and 1920s, electricity began its long march into the domestic interior, into the kitchen, the laundry room, in the living room, in the form of appliances that would, over the following decades, quietly and permanently transform the nature of household labor. The first electric washing machine for home use appeared around 1908. Before it, washing clothes was a full day's work. You heated water on the stove, you scrubbed clothes by hand on a washboard, you wrung them out by hand, you hauled heavy, wet fabric to a line and hung it piece by piece. If the weather turned while the clothes were drying, you brought them back in and started again. Laundry was not a chore in the modern sense of a mildly inconvenient task. It was physical labor, sustained, exhausting, and inescapable. The electric washing machine did not immediately end this labor. The early machines were expensive, unreliable, and required more human supervision than the automatic machines that would come later. But they pointed towards something. They represented, in mechanical form, a new idea. The idea that the labor of the household could be reduced, that the hours spent on survival tasks could be reclaimed for other purposes, that human time and human energy were worth conserving. That idea, once introduced, did not go away. It grew. It was during these same years, the first 2 decades of the century, that something important was also happening to the landscape of American work, not just in the conditions of work, which the labor movement was slowly and painfully beginning to improve, but in the fundamental nature and organization of work itself. In 1913, a man named Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line at his Highland Park plant in Michigan. The assembly line was not Ford's invention. The idea of dividing production into small, specialized, repetitive tasks had been developing in manufacturing for decades. But what Ford did at Highland Park was to bring all of those ideas together into a single, ruthlessly efficient system, and to do it at a scale that had never been attempted before. On the assembly line, each worker did one thing, not several things, not a variety of tasks that required skill and judgment and the kind of intimate knowledge of a whole process that a traditional craftsman possessed. One thing, over and over. The same motion, the same tool, the same part of the same product, hundreds of times a day. The result was astonishing. The time it took to assemble a single Model T fell from over 12 hours to about 93 minutes. The price of the car dropped dramatically, and a machine that had been just a decade earlier a luxury available only to the very wealthy became something that ordinary working Americans could, with some sacrifice, actually afford. Ford's assembly line is usually discussed in the context of economic history, as a story about productivity and innovation and the rise of mass production. All of that is true, but it is also a story about something quieter and more personal. It is a story about the changing relationship between a worker and their work. The craftsman who had built things with his hands, who had known a skill in his body, who had known the whole shape of what he was making, was being replaced by a different kind of worker, a worker whose contribution was a fraction of the whole, a worker who might spend years in a factory and never see the finished product of all those combined fractions, a worker who was more efficient and more interchangeable and, in a certain important sense, more alienated from the meaning of what his hands were doing. This change did not happen without resistance. It did not happen without cost. And it planted in the soil of American working life a question that would grow louder and more insistent over the following century. A question about what work was supposed to mean, about whether efficiency was the same thing as progress, about what was gained and what was lost when the old ways gave way to the new. That question is still being asked today.
There are decades that feel, in retrospect, like they were trying to be two things at once. The 1920s in America was one of those decades. On the surface, it was a time of extraordinary energy. Cities were growing, music was changing, women were cutting their hair short and wearing shorter skirts and dancing in ways that their grandmothers deeply uncomfortable. Automobiles were multiplying on roads that had barely existed a decade earlier. Department stores were filling their windows with goods that an earlier generation could not have imagined affording. There was a feeling, electric, almost feverish, that the old world was giving way to something new, and that the new thing was going to be faster and louder and more exciting than anything that had come before. And underneath all of that energy, quieter and harder to see, something else was happening. Something more uncertain, more anxious. The 1920s was also a decade of people trying to hold on to older values, older certainties, older ways of understanding who they were and where they belonged in the order of things. It was a decade of contradiction between the forward pull of modernity and the backward pull of tradition. And that contradiction, that tension between moving forward and holding on, would define not just the 1920s, but much of the century that followed. To understand the 1920s, you have to understand what came just before it. The years between 1914 and 1920 had been years of enormous disruption. The First World War had taken American men across an ocean to fight in a conflict that many of them barely understood, in a landscape of industrialized slaughter that no previous human experience had prepared them for. Nearly 117,000 American soldiers died in that war. Many more came home wounded, not just physically, but in ways that the language of the time did not yet have words to describe. Then, in 1918, as the war was ending, a different kind of catastrophe arrived. The influenza pandemic swept across the world with terrifying speed, killing more people in a single year than the war had killed in 4.
In the United States alone, somewhere between 500 and 700,000 people died. Cities were overwhelmed. Schools and churches closed. People wore masks on the street and avoided public gatherings and watched their neighbors and family members sicken and die with a swiftness that felt almost incomprehensible. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it receded. By 1920, both the war and the pandemic were over, and Americans, collectively and individually, did something that is perhaps the most human of all possible responses to a period of prolonged darkness. They decided to enjoy themselves. The 1920s roared, as the saying goes, because the previous years had been so relentlessly grim. The energy of the decade was not random. It was the release of accumulated pressure. It was a generation that had seen death up close, deciding with considerable determination that life was going to be lived. And the conditions were right for living it in ways that had never been possible before. The American economy in the early 1920s was expanding rapidly. Wages were rising, at least for many workers. The mass production techniques pioneered by Ford and others were driving down the prices of manufactured goods, making them accessible to a broader range of people than ever before. And something new was entering the picture, something that would, over the following century, become one of the most powerful forces in American life: consumer credit. Before the 1920s, the prevailing American attitude towards debt was deeply cautious. The cultural inheritance of the Protestant work ethic, save first, spend after, never buy what you cannot afford, was strong. Debt was associated with failure, with weakness, with a lack of discipline. Respectable people paid cash. The idea of borrowing money to buy something you wanted but did not strictly need was for most Americans morally uncomfortable at best and shameful at worst. The 1920s began to change that. Installment plans, the ability to pay for a purchase in small amounts over time, had existed in limited forms before the decade, but it was in the 1920s that they became truly widespread. Suddenly, a family that could not afford to buy a refrigerator outright could afford to pay a little each month until it was theirs. The same was true for automobiles, radios, furniture, sewing machines, and the growing range of electrical appliances beginning to appear in stores. This seems on the surface like a straightforward convenience, but it was actually something more significant. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the American relationship with time, specifically with the relationship between present desire and future payment. Buy now, pay later. Enjoy today what tomorrow's earnings will cover. That shift in thinking was quiet. It did not announce itself as a transformation of values. It arrived in the form of practical convenience, of monthly payments that seemed manageable, of the entirely reasonable observation that a family needed a washing machine and could not wait years to save the full price. But over decades, it would reshape the architecture of American economic life in ways that are still being felt today. The automobile was, in the 1920s, the most visible and most transformative technology in American daily life. By 1920, there were already about 8 million registered automobiles in the United States. By 1930, that number had grown to nearly 23 million. In a decade, the number of cars on American roads almost tripled. And roads themselves were changing to accommodate them. In the early years of the automobile, most American roads outside of cities were unpaved, muddy in spring, dusty in summer, icy in winter, and deeply unreliable in all seasons. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 began the process of creating a national system of improved roads, funded partly by the federal government, that would eventually become the vast network of paved highways connecting every corner of the country. The social consequences of this were enormous, and at the time only partially visible. The automobile changed the geography of American life. It made it possible to live at distances from workplaces and shops and family members that previously had been impractical. It began the slow, decades-long process of pulling people away from dense, walkable urban neighborhoods and toward the spread-out, car-dependent suburbs that would eventually become the dominant form of American settlement. But the automobile also changed something more intimate. It changed the social lives of young people in ways that alarmed their parents enormously and fascinated sociologists for decades afterwards.
Before the automobile, courtship, the process by which young men and women found each other and moved toward marriage, was largely supervised. A young man called on a young woman at her family's home. Her parents were present or nearby. The social geography of courtship kept it within the sight and hearing of the older generation. The automobile moved courtship out of the parlor and into the world. A young couple in a car was mobile, private, and beyond the immediate supervision of their families in a way that had no real precedent. This terrified many parents and moralists of the time, who wrote anxiously about the automobile as a threat to the moral order. And in a certain sense, they were right. Not in the catastrophic way they imagined, but in the real sense that the car was indeed changing the terms under which young people experienced independence, privacy, and each other. The 1920s was also the decade in which something happened to American women that was, in retrospect, one of the most significant social shifts of the entire century. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote. This was the culmination of a struggle that had been going on for more than 70 years, and its importance as a political and legal milestone cannot be overstated. But the change happening in American women's lives during the 1920s was broader than the vote. It was a change in the entire social meaning of womanhood. The flapper, the young woman with short hair, short skirts, cosmetics, and an apparent indifference to the expectations of her mother's generation, became the decade's most iconic image. She was, of course, a caricature. Most American women in the 1920s were not flappers in any meaningful sense. They were working in factories and on farms and in domestic service, living lives that were shaped far more by economic necessity than by cultural rebellion. But the flapper pointed towards something real. She was a visible symbol of a deeper shift, the slow expansion of the idea that a woman's life might be defined by more than marriage and motherhood. That she might work not out of necessity but out of choice, that she might have opinions about politics and culture, that she might occupy public space with the same ease and legitimacy as a man. That expansion of possibility was not fast, it was not smooth, it was resisted vigorously by many people, and the resistance had deep cultural and religious roots that did not simply disappear because the calendar turned to a new decade. But the seed had been planted, and seeds, once planted, have a way of growing, whether or not the conditions are entirely favorable. There was another side to the 1920s that is harder to look at directly, but essential to understand. The same decade that celebrated jazz and flappers and the liberating speed of the automobile also saw the Ku Klux Klan reach its peak membership in American history. By the mid-1920s, the Klan had somewhere between 3 and 6 million members, not concentrated in the South as it had been during Reconstruction, but spread across the entire country, with significant membership in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and other northern and Midwestern states. The Klan of the 1920s was not only about race, though race was always at its center. It was also a movement of cultural anxiety, of native-born Protestant white Americans who felt that their country was being taken from them by immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were arriving in large numbers and bringing with them Catholic and Jewish traditions that felt foreign to an older Protestant America.
by the loosening of sexual and social morality that the decade's new freedoms seemed to represent, by the city with its noise and complexity and mixing of peoples, which felt threatening to those whose sense of identity was rooted in a simpler, more homogeneous rural world. That anxiety was real, even if the response to it was monstrous. And the anxiety itself was a symptom of something true, that America was changing, rapidly and irreversibly, in ways that left some people feeling dispossessed of the country they thought they knew. That feeling of a familiar world slipping away, of change as loss rather than gain, would recur throughout the century, taking different forms in different decades, but always expressing the same fundamental tension. The tension between the America that was arriving and the America that people remembered or imagined. The decade ended, as everyone who has studied American history knows, not with a bang, but with a crash. In October of 1929, the stock market collapsed. The decade of energy and excess and consumer confidence came to an abrupt and brutal end. The debt that had accumulated through a decade of installment plans and speculation and the general assumption that tomorrow would always be better today suddenly became visible, a weight that the economy could not carry. But we will come to that story in the next part. For now, it is worth pausing at the end of the 1920s and simply observing what had changed. A decade earlier, most Americans had lived in a world shaped primarily by physical necessity and local community. By 1929, millions of them had cars, radios, electric appliances, and a relationship with manufactured goods and consumer credit that would have been unrecognizable to their parents. They had not become different people, but they had begun to want different things. And wanting different things, it turns out, changes everything.
There are experiences that do not just change circumstances, they change people. Not on the surface, not in the obvious ways that a change of job or address or relationship changes a person, but at the level of what they believe is possible, what they trust, what they fear, and what they decide, quietly and permanently, that they will never allow themselves to be without again. The Great Depression was that kind of experience. It lasted, in its most acute form, from the crash of 1929 through most of the 1930s. Its economic dimensions are well documented. Unemployment that reached 25% at its peak, banks failing by the thousands, farms foreclosed, businesses shuttered, families who had considered themselves solidly middle class finding themselves unable to pay rent or put food on the table. These are the statistics that appear in textbooks, and they are important. But the statistics do not capture what it felt like from the inside. They do not capture the particular texture of a decade in which ordinary Americans had to renegotiate, almost from the ground up, their relationship with security, with the future, and with each other. That renegotiation, quiet, painful, and enormously consequential, is what this part of the story is about. To understand what the Depression did to the American psyche, you have to first understand what the 1920s had done to it. The decade before the crash had been, for a significant portion of Americans, a decade of expanding expectation. Not universal prosperity. The 1920s left many people behind, particularly farmers who had been struggling with falling crop prices for most of the decade, and Black Americans who were largely excluded from the economic gains that white Americans were enjoying. But for a broad swath of the white working and middle class, the 1920s had introduced a new and intoxicating idea. The idea that things would always get better. It seems like a small thing, but it was not. The belief that tomorrow would be more comfortable today, that your children would have more than you had, that the general direction of American life was upward, this belief was, in the 1920s, still relatively new. It had not been the default assumption of earlier generations who had understood hardship as a permanent condition of human existence rather than a temporary inconvenience on the way to something better. Once that belief takes hold, once a generation has organized its financial life and its emotional expectations around the assumption of continuous improvement, the sudden and violent reversal of that assumption does something to people that goes beyond the merely material. It breaks something. In the years between 1929 and 1933, the American economy contracted by nearly a third. Industrial production fell by half. Agricultural prices collapsed so severely that farmers were burning corn for fuel because it was cheaper than coal. In cities, bread lines stretched around blocks. Men who had worn suits to office jobs stood in those lines in their suits because they had not yet acquired the clothes of poverty and did not yet entirely believe that poverty was what they were. That detail, the men in suits standing in bread lines, is one of the most quietly devastating images of the era. It speaks to the particular cruelty of the Depression, which was not just economic deprivation, but the collision of deprivation with expectation. These were not people who had always been poor and had built their lives accordingly. These were people who had believed, with reason, that they were on solid ground and who had woken up one morning to discover that the ground was gone. The psychological impact of that collision was enormous and lasting. Shame was a central feature of Depression-era experience in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance. The cultural assumption of the time, deeply rooted in the Protestant work ethic and in the American mythology of individual self-sufficiency, was that financial failure was personal failure. If you could not provide for your family, there was something wrong with you, not with the economy, not with the system, not with the banks that had speculated recklessly or the policies that had failed to regulate them, with you. This was, of course, a terrible and unjust way to interpret a catastrophe that was manifestly systemic. But culture does not change as quickly as circumstances. And so, millions of Americans carried the weight of their poverty not just as material suffering, but as moral humiliation. And yet, and this is one of the most important things about the Depression, one of the things that gets lost when the story is told only in economic terms, people endured. Not passively, not silently, not without anger or despair, or the kind of grinding exhaustion that comes from years of uncertainty with no clear end in sight. But they endured, and in enduring, they created something. They created communities of mutual aid that operated largely below the level of official notice. Neighbors shared food, families took in relatives who had lost their homes, churches and ethnic fraternal organizations and informal neighborhood networks distributed resources with a thoroughness and efficiency that formal institutions could not match. Women, who were in most households the managers of the domestic economy, became extraordinary practitioners of the art of making almost nothing stretch into something. The ability to can vegetables, to sew and mend clothing, to transform leftover scraps of food into meals that were not just adequate, but nourishing. These skills, which had been valued in an earlier generation and had begun to seem unnecessary in the relative affluence of the 1920s, suddenly became vital again. The women who possessed them were not just keeping their families alive, they were the structural engineers of household survival. It was also during the Depression that something shifted in the American relationship with government. Before the 1930s, the dominant cultural and political attitude toward the federal government was one of deep suspicion. The idea that Washington should concern itself with the economic welfare of ordinary citizens, that it was the government's responsibility to ensure that people had food, work, and shelter, was not widely accepted. It was associated in the minds of many Americans with socialism, with European-style statism, with a weakening of the individual self-sufficiency that was supposed to be the defining characteristic of the American character. Roosevelt changed that, though not entirely and not without enormous resistance. Roosevelt became president in 1933 when the Depression was at its worst. His response, the collection of programs, agencies, and policies known collectively as the New Deal, was not a coherent ideology. It was a series of experiments, some of which worked and some of which did not, driven by a pragmatic determination to do something, anything, to relieve suffering and restore some measure of economic stability.
The programs themselves varied enormously. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work in national parks and forests, planting trees, building trails, and doing conservation work that would benefit the country for generations. The Works Progress Administration employed artists, writers, and musicians alongside construction workers and laborers, creating an astonishing body of public work, murals, guidebooks, oral histories, theater productions that documented American life at one of its most difficult moments. The Social Security Act of 1935 established for the first time a federal system of support for elderly Americans and the unemployed. None of these programs ended the Depression. The economy did not fully recover until the mobilization for the Second World War in the early 1940s. But the New Deal did something that may have been more important than economic recovery alone. It changed the implicit contract between the American government and the American people. Before the New Deal, the understanding, unwritten but deeply felt, was that the government's job was to protect the country from external threats and to maintain the basic conditions of order within it. What happened to individual citizens in their economic lives was, in the main, their own affair. Success was personal, failure was personal. The government was not a participant in the ordinary struggles of ordinary life. After the New Deal, something different was gradually, haltingly, and incompletely established. The idea that the government had some responsibility for the basic economic security of its citizens, that the catastrophic risks of industrial capitalism, unemployment, illness, old age without savings, were not purely individual problems, but social ones, to be managed through collective mechanisms rather than left entirely to individual resourcefulness. This was not a revolution. It was resisted fiercely at the time and has been contested ever since. But it represented a genuine shift in the baseline of what Americans expected their government to be. And expectations, once shifted, are very difficult to shift back. The Depression also changed something in the intimate geography of American families. In the years of the 1920s, the dominant direction of family life had been toward independence, toward the nuclear family, self-contained and self-sufficient in its own home, managing its own affairs. The Depression reversed that direction, at least temporarily. Extended families moved in together out of necessity. Multiple generations shared single households. The grandparents, who might in better times have lived independently, became once again part of the daily fabric of family life. This had complex effects. On one hand, it reintroduced into many households a richness of intergenerational connection that the nuclear family model had begun to dissolve. Children grew up knowing their grandparents not as occasional visitors, but as daily presences, storytellers, repositories of older knowledge and older ways of doing things. On the other hand, the crowding and the financial stress and the collisions between different generations living at close quarters produced friction and tension that left marks on family relationships for years afterward. The children of the Depression, the generation that grew up in those crowded households, that watched their parents stand in lines and plant vegetable gardens in backyards and mend shoes rather than buy new ones, were being shaped by their experiences in ways they could not yet articulate. They were learning at the most fundamental level what insecurity felt like. And they were learning alongside that the particular determination of people who have been through the worst and decided with everything they have that it will not happen again. That determination would define them for the rest of their lives. Decades later, when this generation had grown up and were raising children of their own in the relative prosperity of the post-war years, their Depression-era habits would puzzle and sometimes frustrate their children. They saved obsessively. They wasted nothing. They kept extra food stored, extra money hidden, extra supplies on hand, against the possibility of a catastrophe that to their more comfortable children seemed both distant and unlikely. They could not explain entirely why they did these things. The habits ran deeper than explanation. They were written into the body, into the hands that automatically smoothed and folded a paper bag for reuse, into the eyes that scanned every plate for food that could still be eaten, into the heart that felt, even in the middle of plenty, the cold shadow of possible loss. That shadow was the Depression's most lasting legacy. Not the economic reforms, not the political changes, but the emotional residue, the permanent alertness to the fragility of security that it left in the people who lived through it. And as the 1930s drew to a close, as the New Deal programs were running their course, and the economy was beginning slowly and unevenly to recover, another shadow was gathering on the horizon. Not domestic this time, not economic. The world was moving toward war, again. And America, still exhausted and cautious from a decade of internal struggle, was about to be pulled once more into something larger than itself.
There are moments in history when a society discovers what it is actually capable of, not what it believes itself capable of, not what its politicians claim it can do, or what its economists project, or what its citizens in their ordinary daily lives would ever have thought to attempt, but what it can actually do when the full weight of necessity presses down on it, and the usual reasons for caution and hesitation are swept away by something larger and more urgent than any of them. For America, the Second World War was that moment. What happened to the United States between 1941 and 1945 was not just a military story. It was one of the most complete and rapid transformations of a society that the modern world had ever witnessed. In less than 4 years, a country that had spent a decade mired in economic depression turned inward, suspicious of foreign entanglements, and deeply uncertain about its own future, became the most productive military and industrial power on Earth. That transformation did not happen only in factories and on battlefields. It happened in kitchens and living rooms, in schoolyards, and the interior lives of ordinary people who had never thought of themselves as participants in history, and who found, to their own surprise, that they were. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did something to the American national mood that nothing before it had quite managed. It unified. This is not to say that all Americans suddenly agreed on everything, or that the divisions of race and class and region and politics that ran so deeply through American life simply dissolved in a moment of patriotic feeling. They did not. The war was fought on the American side by a segregated military. Black soldiers served in separate units, were denied the same opportunities as their white counterparts, and returned home from a war fought in the name of freedom to a country that still enforced their legal subjugation in large portions of its territory. That contradiction was real and corrosive and important. But within those limitations, something genuine did happen to the collective American sense of purpose. The uncertainty and fragmentation of the 1930s gave way to a clarity of direction that felt, to many people, almost like relief. There was a job to be done. It was enormous and terrifying and demanded everything, but at least it was clear. The mobilization of the American economy for war was staggering in its scale and speed. In 1940, the United States was producing a modest number of military aircraft per year. By 1944, it was producing nearly 100,000. The shipyards that had been quiet or slow during the Depression were suddenly running around the clock, launching vessels faster than anyone had thought mechanically possible. The automobile factories that had been making cars for American consumers were retooled virtually overnight to produce tanks, jeeps, and military trucks. Henry Kaiser, a California industrialist, applied assembly line principles to shipbuilding with results that astonished the world. His yards built cargo ships, Liberty ships they were called, in an average of 42 days each. One ship, built as a publicity demonstration, was completed in 4 days and 15 hours. These were not small vessels. They were ocean-going cargo ships of 10,000 tons, assembled from prefabricated sections by workers, many of whom had never set foot in a shipyard before the war. The productive capacity that America demonstrated during the war years was not just militarily decisive, it permanently changed the world's understanding and America's own self-understanding of what industrial civilization could achieve when it was fully committed. But the numbers, again, tell only part of the story. The more intimate story, the one that unfolded not in factories, but in homes, is the story of what the war did to the everyday lives of American families. Rationing arrived in 1942. Sugar was the first commodity to be rationed, followed quickly by gasoline, coffee, meat, butter, canned goods, and eventually shoes. Every American household received ration books, small books of stamps that authorized the purchase of limited quantities of controlled goods. When the stamps were gone, you could not buy more of that item, regardless of whether you had money. This was, for a generation that had just come through the Depression, not entirely unfamiliar territory. The habits of conservation and making do that the 1930s had enforced were still fresh. But rationing introduced a new dimension, not the deprivation of poverty, but the organized, collective, nationally mandated sharing of scarcity. You went without not because you were poor, but because someone else, a soldier in the Pacific, a family in a bombed-out city in England, needed what you had. That framing mattered. It transformed sacrifice from humiliation into patriotism. The woman who carefully measured out her family's weekly butter ration was not a failure. She was a participant. She was doing her part. The garden she planted in her backyard, a victory garden they were called, and millions of them appeared across the country during the war years, was not a sign of hardship. It was a statement of contribution. And then there was the matter of women and work. When the war began pulling men out of factories and offices and into the military, the gap they left behind had to be filled. It was filled in enormous numbers by women. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of women in the American workforce increased by about 6 million. Women took jobs in aircraft factories, shipyards, munitions plants, and steel mills, jobs that were, before the war, almost exclusively male, and that required physical strength and mechanical skill that the prevailing cultural assumptions of the time insisted women did not possess. They possessed it.
The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman in the polka-dotted headscarf with her sleeve rolled up and her bicep flexed, her expression one of calm and capable determination, was a wartime propaganda creation. But it pointed towards something real. Millions of American women were doing heavy industrial work, doing it competently, and in the process, discovering something about themselves and about the world's assumptions regarding what they were capable of. What would happen to those women and to those discoveries when the war ended is a story that belongs to the next decade. But the seed of it was planted here, in the factories of the early 1940s, in the daily experience of women who had stepped into roles that had been closed to them and had found that the door, once opened, was very difficult to close again. The home front, as it was called, was also a place of profound social mixing that the ordinary geography of American life, with its rigid separations of race and class and ethnicity, would not normally have produced. War industries drew workers from all over the country to places where the factories were, to Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles and the shipbuilding centers of the Gulf Coast. People who had spent their entire lives in small towns in Alabama or rural communities in Oklahoma found themselves living in crowded war worker housing in cities they had never seen before, working alongside people whose backgrounds, languages, and customs were entirely unfamiliar.
This mixing was not always harmonious. Racial tensions in wartime cities were severe, and in several cases, most notably in Detroit in 1943, they erupted into serious violence. The pressures of crowding, competition for housing, and the general strains of a society under the stress of war created conditions in which existing hostilities intensified rather than dissolved. But the mixing also happened in ways that were quieter and more lasting. Regional accents began to soften as people from different parts of the country spent years living and working together. Cuisines and customs traveled with their people and took root in new places. The rigid provincialism of a country in which many people had lived their entire lives within 50 miles of their birthplace began gradually and incompletely to loosen. America was becoming, slowly and painfully, and not without conflict, somewhat more aware of its own internal diversity. For the men who went to war, the experience was, in the most literal sense, world-expanding. Many of the soldiers who served in the Second World War were young men who had never been more than a day's drive from their hometowns. Suddenly, they were in England, in North Africa, in the islands of the Pacific, in the cities and countryside of France and Germany and Italy. They were seeing the physical world, its variety, its scale, its beauty, and its devastation in ways that their previous lives had given them no preparation for. They were also, in many cases, encountering for the first time the reality that the United States was one country among many, that there were other ways of organizing a society, other assumptions about the relationship between individual and community, other standards of what constituted a good life. Some of what they saw abroad confirmed their pride in their country. Some of it complicated that pride in ways they could not fully articulate when they came home, but that influenced quietly and persistently the ways they thought about America and its place in the world. The letters they wrote home from overseas are among the most extraordinary documents of American life in the 20th century. They are full of the specific, observed details of places and people, the smell of a French village, the strange formality of an English pub, the particular quality of light on a Pacific island at dawn. These were men learning, through immersion, that the world was larger and stranger and more interesting than anything they had been taught to expect. And they were learning something else, something that would shape the rest of their lives in ways that were both remarkable and deeply complicated. They were learning what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The violence of the Second World War was of a scale and character that defies ordinary language. The European theater, in particular, confronted American soldiers with evidence of systematic human cruelty, most devastatingly in the concentration camps that were liberated in the final weeks of the war in Europe, that could not be processed through any framework that their previous experience had provided. Most of these men did not talk about what they had seen, not to their families, not to their children, sometimes not even to each other. They came home and they got on with things, because getting on with things was what you did. The cultural expectation of the time, of stoicism, of the suppression of emotional expression as a condition of male dignity, meant that the inner life of the returning veteran was largely invisible to the world around him. But it was not absent. It was there, in the nightmares that woke men in the middle of quiet suburban nights, in the flinching at loud sounds, in the drinking that was accepted as a normal feature of social life in the post-war years, in ways that, looking back, suggest something more than mere sociability. In the silences that fell over dinner tables when certain subjects came too close. The greatest generation, as they would eventually be called, carried their war inside them for the rest of their lives, and the weight of what they carried shaped the families they built and the culture they created in the post-war years in ways that were rarely acknowledged but deeply felt. By the end of 1945, the war was over. The men were coming home. The factories were beginning the process of conversion back to civilian production. The rationing was ending. The country was exhaling, slowly, from 4 years of total mobilization. And America was standing at a threshold. Behind it lay a decade of depression and 4 years of war, 15 years of hardship and sacrifice and deferred living. Ahead of it lay something that no one had quite seen before, a combination of pent-up demand, accumulated savings, industrial capacity without equal in the world, and a generation of young men and women who had survived the worst and were ready, with an urgency that was almost physical, to build something. What they built, what America became in the years after 1945, was, in many ways, the most dramatic chapter of the entire silent evolution. The world was about to change faster than it ever had before, and most of the people living through it would experience it, as always, as simply Tuesday.
There is a particular kind of photograph that defined the 1950s in America. You have seen it, or something very much like it, many times. A house with a neat lawn in front of it, a car in the driveway, large, chrome-accented, impossibly optimistic in its design. A man in a suit arriving home from work, a woman in a dress standing at the door, 2 or 3 children somewhere in the frame, clean and orderly, a dog, perhaps, a barbecue grill visible around the side of the house. Everything in the photograph is new. The house is new, the car is new, the appliances visible through the kitchen window are new, the neighborhood itself is new, built recently on land that was farmland or woodland just a few years earlier, laid out in the clean geometric patterns of the post-war subdivision. The photograph radiates a particular kind of satisfaction. A satisfaction that feels, from a distance of several decades, almost too complete, too settled, too sure of itself. And that is precisely what makes it interesting, because underneath that satisfaction, underneath the gleaming surfaces and the ordered lawns and the confidence of a nation that had won the war and was now building the peace, something else was present, something quieter and less comfortable. A set of pressures and questions and unresolved tensions that the photograph did not show, and that the decade, for the most part, preferred not to discuss. The 1950s was not what it looked like, or rather, it was what it looked like and also something quite different, simultaneously. Understanding both of those things is essential to understanding what came after. The post-war prosperity that defined the 1950s was real, and it was genuinely remarkable. When the soldiers came home in 1945 and 1946, they came home to a country that was, economically speaking, in an extraordinary position. The war had ended the Depression completely. The industrial capacity that had been built up during the war years was now available for civilian production, and there was demand, enormous, accumulated, years-long demand for all the things that Americans had been unable to buy during the Depression and the war. Houses, cars, appliances, furniture, the ordinary material infrastructure of a comfortable domestic life. The GI Bill, formerly the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, played a crucial role in what followed. It provided returning veterans with access to low-cost mortgages, tuition assistance for college, and unemployment benefits while they transitioned back to civilian life. Its effects were transformative. Millions of men who might otherwise have returned to factory jobs or farm labor instead went to college, entered professions, and used federally subsidized mortgages to buy homes in the new suburbs that were springing up around every major American city. The expansion of the American middle class during the late 1940s and 1950s was, by historical standards, almost without precedent. A way of life that had previously been accessible only to a relatively small segment of the population, the comfortable, educated, home-owning middle class, became, within the space of a single decade, the dominant experience of white America. That qualification, white America, is essential and must not be passed over. The prosperity of the 1950s was distributed with a profound and deliberate unevenness. The GI Bill, in practice, largely excluded black veterans, not through explicit language in the legislation itself, but through the mechanisms of its administration, through local banks that refused to approve mortgages for black applicants, through universities in the South that remained segregated and therefore inaccessible, through neighborhoods where deed restrictions explicitly prohibited the sale of homes to non-white buyers. The suburbs that were being built in these years, places like Levittown in New York and Pennsylvania, the prototype of the post-war subdivision, were, by deliberate policy, white. William Levitt, who built them, included racial restrictions in his leases and sales contracts. He was not unusual in doing so. The Federal Housing Administration, which underwrote the mortgages that made suburban home ownership possible for millions of Americans, had itself recommended racial segregation in its lending guidelines. The result was the systematic creation of a geography of inequality that would shape American life for generations. White families accumulated wealth through home ownership in appreciating suburban markets. Black families, denied access to those same markets, were confined to urban neighborhoods where housing values were suppressed by overcrowding and disinvestment. The wealth gap that was created and codified during these years did not dissolve when the legal barriers to integration were eventually removed. It persisted because wealth accumulated across generations, and the generation that had been excluded from the great post-war wealth-building opportunity passed that exclusion forward to their children and grandchildren. This is part of the silent history, too. Not the silence of things happening without notice, but the silence of things being deliberately not discussed, of a prosperity that presented itself as universal when it was, in crucial ways, anything but. For those Americans who did have access to the post-war prosperity, and they were many, the 1950s represented something genuinely new in the human experience. The suburb was a new kind of place, not city and not country. It occupied a middle ground that had no real historical precedent. It offered space, physical space, the room to breathe and move grass and park a car that urban living had never provided for working people. And it offered privacy, the ability to close a door and be in your own world that had been the exclusive province of the wealthy in earlier eras. But the suburb also created a new kind of isolation. The traditional urban neighborhood was dense, noisy, and intimately social. People lived close together. They knew their neighbors not by choice, but by proximity. They shared walls and stoops and sidewalks and the general noise of common life. Community was not something you created by effort. It was something that existed because the physical conditions of urban living made it almost impossible to avoid. The suburb was different. Houses were set apart on individual lots. The car meant that daily life, shopping, working, socializing, did not require walking through the neighborhood. You could get in your car in your garage and arrive at your destination without any spontaneous encounter with the people who lived around you. Community in the suburb had to be created deliberately. It had to be chosen and organized and maintained through conscious effort. This was, in many ways, a more demanding form of social existence than it appeared. The cheerful togetherness of the 1950s suburb, the backyard barbecues and the neighborhood association meetings, and the children playing together on manicured lawns was real, but it was also effortful. It was a sociability that had to be performed and maintained, rather than one that arose naturally from the conditions of living. And for some people, particularly women, the suburb could be profoundly lonely. The domestic ideal of the 1950s placed women at the center of the home and defined that placement as fulfillment. The post-war years had seen a significant reversal of the wartime expansion of women's roles in the workforce. When the men came home, women were expected, and in many cases required, as industries laid off female workers to make room for returning veterans, to return to domestic life. The message from popular culture, advertising, psychology, and a wide range of social authorities was consistent and relentless. A woman's highest calling was to be a good wife and mother. Fulfillment was domestic. Ambition beyond the household was at best a distraction, and at worst a symptom of neurosis. Many women genuinely embraced this ideal. The desire for stability and domesticity after years of depression and war was real and understandable. The chance to build a home and raise children in comfort and security was not something to be dismissed. But many other women found in the quiet of their well-appointed suburban houses that something was wrong. Not wrong in any way that was easy to name. The houses were comfortable, the husbands were in many cases kind and hard-working, the children were healthy and cared for. By every external measure, life was good. And yet, a woman named Betty Friedan would eventually give this unmaimed wrongness a name. She called it the problem that has no name. Her book, published in 1963, described the pervasive dissatisfaction of educated American women trapped in a domestic ideal that did not use their full capacities or speak to their full humanity. But the book was describing something that had been building throughout the 1950s, something that thousands of women were experiencing privately, in isolation, each assuming that the discomfort was her own personal failing rather than the symptom of a structural problem. That private, unshared dissatisfaction was accumulating, quietly, through the decade. The 1950s was also a decade lived under a shadow that is difficult to fully convey to people who did not experience it. The shadow of nuclear war. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. The arms race that followed, the rapid development on both sides of weapons of incomprehensibly destructive power, created a background condition of existential anxiety that was woven into the fabric of daily American life in ways both obvious and subtle. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools, crouching under their desks and covering their heads, a procedure that offered essentially no protection against nuclear blast or radiation, but that provided the psychological comfort of doing something. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Civil defense programs instructed Americans on how to prepare for nuclear attack, as though adequate preparation were possible. The absurdity of these preparations was not lost on everyone. There was a dark comedy to the idea of sheltering under a school desk from a weapon capable of vaporizing an entire city. But the drills and the shelters and the civil defense pamphlets served a psychological purpose beyond their negligible practical value. They gave people something to do with their fear. They translated an unmanageable terror into manageable tasks. The anxiety did not disappear, but it was made to fit into the framework of normal life, of Tuesday, of the school day and the grocery run and the neighborhood barbecue. Americans of the 1950s learned to live with the permanent background possibility of annihilation in much the same way that people learn to live with any chronic condition, not by resolving it, but by finding ways to go on despite it. And yet, beneath the conformity and the anxiety and the carefully maintained surfaces of 1950s life, something was stirring. The children who had been born during and just after the war were growing up. They were the first generation to grow up entirely within the post-war world, to know nothing of the Depression or the war except as stories told by their parents. They had grown up in relative comfort, in the expanding prosperity of the post-war years, with more material security than any previous American generation had known. And they were beginning, quietly at first, and then with increasing volume, to ask questions that the prevailing culture of the decade preferred not to address. Questions about conformity, about the cost of the organized, managed, surface-smooth life that the suburb represented, about race and justice and the gap between America's stated ideals and its actual practices, about whether the life their parents had built, comfortable, secure, relentlessly normal, was the life they wanted to live. These questions were just beginning to find their voices at the end of the 1950s. A young singer from Mississippi was doing something to popular music that made parents deeply uncomfortable, and young people feel, for reasons they could not entirely articulate, that someone was finally speaking directly to them. A small group of writers in New York and San Francisco were producing work that rejected the values of middle-class respectability with a cheerful and provocative completeness. And in the cities and towns of the South, Black Americans were beginning with extraordinary courage and discipline to dismantle in public the legal architecture of racial subjugation that had been built over decades. The decade that looked like contentment was ending. The decade of rupture was about to begin.
The story of America's silent evolution does not end with a single moment. It does not end with a law passed or a war won or a generation finally laying down its burdens. It ends the way it began, quietly, in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the slow and almost invisible shifting of what people expect, what they endure, and what they refuse to endure any longer. We began this story in 1900, in a country where nearly half the population still worked the land, where children labored alongside adults, where a home without electricity or running water was simply a normal home, where life expectancy hovered around 47 years, and the loss of a child was not a tragedy that shattered families, but a sorrow that most families had already learned to carry. That world is gone. Not forgotten, but gone, replaced, piece by piece, decade by decade, through the kind of change that never announces itself, but that reshapes everything it touches. The industrial age taught Americans to produce more than any nation in history had ever produced. The progressive era taught them to demand that the fruits of that production be shared more fairly. The First World War and the influenza pandemic taught them how fragile the world could be. The 1920s taught them to want things they had never been allowed to want before. The Great Depression taught them what it costs to want without foundation and what it means to lose everything and still get up the next morning. The Second World War taught them that they were capable of more than they had imagined. And the 1950s, that decade of gleaming surfaces and quiet anxieties, taught them that prosperity without justice is not peace, that comfort without meaning is not fulfillment, that a country can look from the outside like it has everything and still be carrying something unresolved deep in its interior. These were not lessons that arrived in classrooms or in speeches. They arrived in the form of lived experience, accumulated slowly, passed from parents to children in ways that were rarely spoken aloud, but never entirely lost. That is what makes this history silent. Not that it was hidden, but that it was lived rather than declared. It happened in the hands that kneaded bread during the Depression, and the hands that riveted aircraft during the war, and the hands that signed mortgage papers for a small house in a new suburb, and the hands that held signs on the streets of Montgomery and Birmingham. America did not become what it is through the actions of its famous figures alone. It became what it is through the 10,000 daily decisions of ordinary people who were simply trying to live their lives, and who, in the trying, changed everything. That is the silent evolution. That is the story that happens between the headlines. And it is, in the truest sense, still happening, in every generation that inherits the world as it is and begins, quietly and without announcement, to make it into something else. The stone is still being shaped. The water is still moving.